Daniel,
Hi, hello.
how's it going?
Pretty good. Thanks for putting on this event.
We're really excited about it. I would thank you for, as I said in the intro, I think it was your and my kind of very brief brainstorm thinking that a lot of the open source AI community isn't connected, and being able to put something together that would bring everyone into one place. I'll tell you the one, I'm going to mention this to Becca, that the one thing that I don't understand why we're testing out StreamYard to use this, which is amazing software. Every time I've used StreamYard, it, like when I'm on Twitter, it shows that I am live. It like puts a little circle around you, and it didn't this time. The one time I needed it to do it. I don't quite know why. So I don't know if it's, hopefully we'll still get some distribution on X. So thank you for joining. And thank you for helping kind of come up with this thing, that the AI filibuster.
I love how quickly this went from just a conversation idea stage to now it's actually happening.
Yeah. Me too. I think it's a testament to how much everybody really wanted to just get everyone together. So, and very obvious as soon as we thought about it, just to give people background, immediately obvious it needed to be global, because any one physical location doesn't have nearly the density of open source. It's like open source is definitionally distributed and global, and almost needs to be virtual. So first of all, so thank you for joining. You might have talked a little bit, but can you share what the current product is at Flower for the people who aren't familiar, and then I'll get into kind of why open source and business model.
There's current product and there's also a new product that we launched in preview. But sort of the thing that we've been working on for a number of years now is the Flower framework. So Flower is an open source framework for training and evaluating AI on distributed data. So this approach is called federated learning, or also federated evaluation. But really the framework is pretty generic, and you can use it for also for distributed LLM training. And we've shown we've set a couple of interesting records in that space, and showed how this can be used to access more data that is distributed across different organizations, or even distributed across mobile devices, to incorporate that data into your AI model building workflow.
So and can you talk about kind of where you started and what it looked like then, and the evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. So Flower has sort of a little bit an unconventional background when it comes to just a startup story. We've actually started an open source framework in 2020. Back then, federated learning was more of a niche thing. It was known in research labs around the globe, and a couple of very large organizations had these systems built completely from scratch. But apart from that, in industry, it wasn't very well known. We started the framework, we immediately had some users, and sort of the community grew over the years. And then in 2022, we saw just a considerable uptick in industry interest in federated learning. There were large organizations that built in-house teams. And that's when we decided to actually start a startup around the framework, which is what we did in early 23. We went through Y Combinator, connected with you, and the rest is sort of recent history.
And in terms of, we were talking in the last panel about kind of why open source. What was that? I mean, the team has research backgrounds, and so I'm noticing that as a common thread. But did you ever consider it not being open source? Maybe that's a way to start.
No, it was actually interesting. It's an interesting question. I never thought about it, but it was never on my mind to not make this open source, because fundamentally, when we started the open source framework, there was this fundamental belief that this is something that is important, and it's important to eventually break through this barrier of accessing more data and training better models. We see some amazing models these days in areas where you have sufficient amounts of data, but then there are many other areas like healthcare, for example. We haven't seen a ChatGPT moment in healthcare, even though we have the model architectures and If we look at all the hospitals around the globe, we have massive amounts of data. But the interesting thing is this data is distributed. It's not in a single place. And the current methodologies, all of the centralized methodologies, the traditional way to train models, it just doesn't allow you to access that data. So fundamentally, from an open source perspective, we could have built this in a proprietary way, but it would never reach the scale that we want to see. Open source for me is the only way to get this technology into the hands of as many users as possible, and then to build large networks, because the size of the network eventually it determines the amount of data you can use for training. And that in turn is a huge factor in the model quality you can achieve. So fundamentally, we always believe that this needs to be open source because the potential is huge, and we want to get this into the hands of as many users and researchers and organizations as possible.
And okay, so your mission, let's call it like mission oriented in terms of open source. Although not unlike the last conversation, it was a way to get it. I mean, it's freemium in some ways. Like it is a way to get into the hands of people who wouldn't necessarily be looking for a business to solve this problem. Is sort of like understanding what the software is, being able to verify how it works, especially in your world. How do you think about what I'll call kind of business model exploration? Because I think that every company, whether it's Huggingface or Black Forest, we were talking about not necessarily knowing at the beginning exactly what the business model was going to look like. How do you think about that exploration?
Yeah, so we're still early in that phase, but I don't like to think about it so much in terms of this is open source versus here's some parts that we do closed source that we then start to monetize. But I think for me, there's one beautiful way to think about it where if you build open source, there's only so much you can do to make your users' lives easier by just giving them code. Eventually, somebody will have to take that code. They will have to run that code in some way. They'll have to integrate it with some systems that they have. They'll have to do a bunch of other stuff just to make use of that code. And all of that stuff that they do around it is still quite a bit of effort. And it's still, if we think, especially in AI, where often the user is kind of a researcher or data scientist, for them, operating such a system at scale in a secure way is often sort of not the core skill set that is there. So the way I think about it is what we've done with the framework and what we'll do later on with also parts that we're going to monetize is we sort of continuously made it easier and easier to adopt these distributed AI approaches. It started out with the framework, and then additional framework in the additional features in the framework made it easier and easier. And then eventually there's sort of this natural barrier where we can only make it easier if we start to run some services on behalf of the user. And then once we start to run some services, that's where I think naturally there will be some points where it just makes sense to monetize.
That's interesting. I mean, we didn't talk about that the last time. I mean, that's sort of for any product, you want the trust of the open source, and I think to some degree the distribution. But then, depending on what even like individual features within a product, sometimes running those at scale, which is where the kind of customers are anyway, becomes its own problem to solve. And so to what degree can you sort of say, okay, and then we're seeing a bunch of products, I think, see some early success with this. As you can call them hosted versions, but I think they're actually a bit more deep than that. It's like when the hosting requires meaningful infrastructure to do.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also, I think, an important part whenever you go to production with such a system is integrations into third-party systems. So, for example, the Flower open source framework that we have, it's super flexible, and because it's open source, you can literally customize anything, and you can integrate it with your systems in just any way you'd like. But then for some users, they just want to have an opinionated version where they can just easily create a user and then use that user and give them some permissions and so on. So I think a nice way is also to have sort of a lot of flexibility in the open source framework. Anyone can integrate it if they want to do the work, if they have strong opinions about how it should work. But then you also give them an opinionated version that does a couple of things, just everything works out of the box. It's a little bit, I think about it a little bit along the lines of GitLab or GitHub and Git. Anyone could run their own Git server, but most people, they just prefer to have an opinionated Git server with users and everything on GitHub or GitLab.
That's a really interesting analogy. And I like the idea of it's like opinionated as a service. It's not necessarily that the product is better or worse, but the product is designed for a particular optimization. Daniel, thank you so much for joining in and sharing Flower and also how you're thinking about all this stuff. If anybody wants to try it out, where can they go to check out the newest version of Flower?
Flower.ai.
Amazing. All right. I'll see you soon. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.